Good afternoon and assalamu alaikum, everyone. And to many of the people joining from different parts of the world, good morning and good evening as well. My name is Kulsum Ghayas, and as always, on behalf of the organizing committee of the Sixth Sense Forum, it's my pleasure to welcome you to one of our events today. 6SF organizes lectures and events because we firmly believe that free and open and diverse academic discourse is what makes an institution great. We've organized more than 60 or close to 60 of these sessions. Today happens to be the 57th session. You saw some of the previous ones rolling in the presentation right before we started. And we've been doing this since 2009, covering diverse topics, everything from astronomy to art, political science, poetry, music, and literature. And the speakers have been from within the Aga Khan University, within the country, and even beyond Pakistan. We've also had several discussions under the Apna Karachi and Apna Pakistan banner. And the attempt of this was really to bring the discussion out of the ivory tower, focus on the issues that are so abundant and prevalent in the country, but more importantly, also talk about solutions. So today's topic of climate change really is not just a Karachi or a Pakistan problem, but really a global one. At this point, I'd like to take an opportunity to call your attention to a new initiative of the Aga Khan University. It's called the Institute for Global Health and Development. The Institute is a research-intensive undertaking that leverages not only AKU's own depth of expertise in health sciences, but also the Aga Khan Development Network's far-reaching capacities to galvanize action regionally and globally. Led by Dr. Zulfikar Bhutta, who is no stranger to all of us and certainly no stranger to large-scale projects involving high-level global partnerships, the Institute is taking up climate change as one of its core thematic themes and focus areas for interdisciplinary research and action. Climate change is, as today's webinar will underscore and maybe shake some of us up into action, one of the most significant factors already affecting the health and well-being of all of us, and the world's most vulnerable populations in specific. If you're joining us today and you'd like more information about the Institute, please feel free to visit the IGHD website. It's accessible at www.aku.edu/IGHD, and that stands for the Institute for Global Health and Development. We moved to an online format during the current circumstances, and I'm truly grateful for the support of our IT colleagues, public affairs, and the members of the 6SF organizing committee for making all of this happen. And before I go ahead and introduce today's speaker, I just want to bring everybody's attention to the chat feature of this webinar. It's going to go live shortly, and it's going to be used for question and answers. So please, as soon as our speaker begins to talk, and if you have questions that are burning, do go ahead and post them in the chat. We'll pose them at the end of the session for our speaker to answer. So it's really now my privilege to invite today's speaker, Ahmad Rafay Alam, who was Yale World Fellow of 2014, is a partner at Saleem Alam and Company. It's a law firm that provides specialization in water, energy, natural resources, and urban infrastructure sectors. He currently serves as a member of the Pakistan Climate Change Council and Punjab Environmental Protection Council. He has served as chairman of the Lahore Electric Supply Company and Lahore Waste Management Company, and as vice chairman of the Government of Punjab Urban Unit. Mr. Alam lectures on business and environmental law at the Lahore University of Management Sciences, that is LUMS, and modules on water, environment, and climate change at the National Institute of Management and Lahore School of Economics. He's also the lead course instructor on water law at the Panjwani Hisar Water Institute at NED University. Mr. Alam also serves as an advisor to Air Quality Asia, a member of the Hisar Foundation think tank on the rational use of water, and is a founding member of the Lahore Biennale Foundation and Critical Mass Lahore. Last September, Mr. Alam helped coordinate the climate strikes organized by Climate Action PK in over 40 cities in Pakistan. And with that truly impressive resume, I hand it over to Rafay, over to you to talk about the climate crisis and our future.
Assalamu alaikum ji. Thank you, Kulsum. Thank you, Aga Khan University, and thank you, team at the Sixth Sense Forum, for inviting me. It's indeed my privilege to speak to you about the climate crisis, which has been something for the last year or so has been, you could say, on my mind. I suppose at this point, I don't have to get into any great detail about where the climate crisis has come from. We all know that it is greenhouse gas emissions that are trapping the sun's heat in the Earth's atmosphere and raising global temperatures. These greenhouse gases are, I mean, they can be naturally produced as well through agriculture or through natural activity, but predominantly since the Industrial Revolution have been produced on Earth by man-made endeavors, mostly for our energy and transport needs. These increasing greenhouse gas emissions have led to, I'm sure some of you saw pictures of San Francisco on fire. This year, the wildfires in California's forests were the most severe ever recorded in history. And it's well established that climate change is associated with these fires on account of the dry conditions and heat that is resulting from the climate crisis. But this apocalyptic picture is just one of many. Again, earlier this year, it seems such a long time ago, we saw immense and again unprecedented forest fires in Australia, again started by the climate crisis. And while there was immeasurable loss of human life, hundreds of millions of animals also perished, many unable to escape the flames, and many unable to survive afterwards because their nourishment and food had also been destroyed in the flames. It's these sorts of events that put biodiversity at risk and destroy, literally, varieties of species. This year in 2020, we saw forest fires in the Arctic Circle for the first time as well. Actually, not for the first time, we saw them last year as well. But temperatures in the Arctic Circle this year soared to over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, some of the highest ever on record. And this year, you'll see that as temperatures drop during the winter months, we are not seeing a resurgence of sea ice in the Arctic and Antarctic poles. This is incredibly dangerous as well because it means that the Earth is reaching perhaps a tipping point. Because once we lose the ability of the Arctic to generate ice, we'll never be able to generate that again. It's called a tipping point environmentally. And so established weather patterns will be forever disrupted if this were to take place, as it appears to be happening as well. But not just forest fires around the world and in the Arctic Circle. Let me hone in and talk about a bit of the climate crisis here in Pakistan. We're all familiar with the wheat crisis that has plagued our polity this year because of various political decisions, but also because, and I'd like to point this out, there was an unseasonal April shower in areas of Punjab last year that destroyed a large proportion of the wheat crop. This was very much news at the time because it wasn't expected, and it did result in the loss of livelihoods and incomes for many people in rural areas in Punjab. So that's what one aspect of climate change looks like in Pakistan. Another is the news of a few years ago, if you recall, in Karachi, that a heat wave took over 1,000 lives. And again, as temperatures rise, our urban areas are ill-suited, especially those areas that don't get electricity or those homes that don't have the benefit of air conditioners, literally become ovens in temperatures that we will now expect to see in the region of 46 to 49 degrees centigrade. This is slightly outside the ability of the human body to withstand and can become very, very lethal. Of course, you've heard of smog season in Punjab. The University of Chicago's Air Quality Life Index estimates that Lahoris lose on average 5 years of life expectancy on account of the various pollutants they inhale in the air pollution. And just this year, earlier this year, a national emergency was declared in Pakistan on account of a plague of locusts, a biblical plague of locusts associated with how forest fires are considered to be associated with natural breeding cycle, which was prolonged because of unseasonal wet winters these last 4 years. And so populations have been able to breed into plague-like statuses from the Horn of Africa through to India, causing immense devastation to the agriculture in these regions. And most recently, the residents of Karachi experienced, in just a few nights of rain, their city, the largest commercial hub in Pakistan, come to a complete standstill with many still today, weeks afterwards, impacted by the climate event that they experienced not too long ago. So the climate crisis is not something that is about to happen or is on the horizon. We're seeing this almost every single day around the world and also in Pakistan. And it's playing out in very many different ways. The evidence and science behind this is now irrefutable. We measure greenhouse gas emissions by counting the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere. And here's a chart, a historical chart of carbon concentrations in the atmosphere. We are at 2020, somewhere in the region of 400 to 410 parts per million of carbon concentration in the atmosphere. And according to this chart, you'd have to go back beyond 1,000, beyond 1,000,000 to approximately 25 million years ago to find a similar level of concentration of carbon in the atmosphere. And just to put that into scale, the human species hasn't been on planet Earth more than 1.2, 1.3 million years. So we're talking now of a time scale of experience that's far beyond us as a species even. And you could Google this. The last time the carbon concentration was so high, it was a extinction event on account of a meteor hitting the Earth. So we are very much in extinction event territory on account of the carbon concentrations in the atmosphere. Corresponding to these increases in greenhouse gases have been increases in temperature. And we can see roughly from the middle of the Industrial Revolution till today that there has been a consistent increase in global temperatures that correspond to the emissions of greenhouse gases. So the correlation between the two is very much evident and very much there. As a matter of fact, knowledge about how carbon emissions and greenhouse gases would cause temperature increase has been known as early as 1898 and through the 20th century. But the international community formally sat down and agreed on a strategy to mitigate and combat climate change in 1992 by signing on to something known as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC. The objective of which is, it's underlined here, the stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous man-made interference with climate cycles. And the aim here was to be able to stabilize these greenhouse gases over the course of the 21st century in a way that was also congruent with economic development and sustainable development. At the time in 1992, through the execution of something called the Kyoto Protocol in 1996, this stabilization was set at it was set at 2 degrees warming. This was the stated aim of the Kyoto Protocol, to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions so that global temperatures wouldn't rise over 2 degrees centigrade compared to pre-industrial levels. And this was done through a mandatory system known as cap and trade. The Kyoto Protocol's ambition of restricting temperatures to 2 degrees was increased, in fact, through the Paris Agreement, which sought to restrict global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees of warming compared to pre-industrial levels. But the Paris Agreement is not a mandatory agreement, it's a voluntary agreement and uses a system known as nationally determined contributions, where countries pledge to reduce their greenhouse gases in a way that will meet the limit of 1.5 degrees of warming. Oops. So this is what it looks like. With that as a stated ambition of the UNFCCC, the stabilization of greenhouse gas emissions, and the vision of the Paris Agreement that through nationally determined contributions, temperatures could be kept to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees within this century. But the truth is that since the execution of the Paris Agreement, or indeed since the execution of the Kyoto Protocol or the UNFCCC, there has been no stabilization of greenhouse gas emissions internationally. There's only been an increase. And if we are to, the international community is to keep global temperatures from rising no more than 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees of warming, they would have to cut greenhouse gas emissions through a factor that's made visible by this green bar on the chart in front of you. That's if you want to keep temperatures to 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. But the truth is that current pledges, the actual nationally determined contributions, if you add them up, amount to an increase in temperature somewhere in the region of 2.5 to 3.2 degrees centigrade. But these are just the pledges. If you actually look at practical policies on the ground today, they seem to be looking at a world where temperatures could increase as much as 3.7 degrees. And then there are some truly horrible scenarios where, without any intervention, as they say, business as usual, temperatures could increase this century as much as 5 degrees centigrade. And to put this into context, the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees of warming, I must tell you this, that these limits of 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees aren't like the speed limits that you might find on a highway, where penalties and damages accrue only after you've tipped over the limit. No, this is not how climate change works. Here in 2020, with the photographs and evidence of the climate crisis I've shown you, let me tell you that we are approximately 1.1 degrees hotter today than we were before the Industrial Revolution. These limits of 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees are the politically acceptable amount of damage international governments internationally are willing to bear. Politically bear. Because the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees of warming, put in terms of human life, is approximately the death of approximately 150 million people, mostly in cities in Asian and African countries on account of air pollution caused by greenhouse gas emissions. That's just 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees. It gets worse as temperatures get higher and higher. Here's another chart to put things into perspective. Right now, we're about 1 degree of global warming compared to pre-industrial levels. We have produced enough greenhouse gases today in 2020 to lock in, as scientists now say, to lock in a 2-degree temperature increase by 2030, as soon as 2030. And if we continue to burn greenhouse gases the way we do, we're set at a current trajectory where we're going to see an increase of 3 degrees of global warming by 2060 or by the middle of the century. These figures are very, very pertinent to note because as temperatures get higher, we'll see at approximately 2 degrees the failure of global agriculture, where crops might not be able to properly produce if temperatures are too high or if water isn't available. And at 3 degrees centigrade, most scientists agree that there isn't a tree or plant on Earth that has the evolutionary capability to be able to withstand the type of heat that's expected to. So we're entering into very, very dangerous territory when it comes to the climate crisis. It's usually at this stage that people ask me, what is it that we can do about the climate crisis? And I'd like to come to that in just a second. But again, just to put the scale of the challenge in front of us, if we as a world, as a human society, wish to achieve the aims of the Paris Agreement and keep global temperatures within 1.5 degrees of warming compared to pre-industrial levels, we will have to reduce greenhouse gases at a rate that's shown over here by the green and blue lines. Now, if you look at the past increase in greenhouse gases, that is an unprecedented reduction in the use of greenhouse gases, unprecedented. And the truth is, given how energy dependent we have become as a human society, it's very difficult to envision such a future, either economically or even socially. But this is the type of trajectory or the type of future we're looking at if you want to meet the 1.5 degree or 2 degree limits. Unprecedented amounts of effort would have to be made. Even the impacts of the lockdown during this year of COVID have been just a proportion of what's needed every single year to be able to deal with the climate crisis. So what can we do about the climate crisis? And, here I have to say, first of all, this is a problem that's larger than us as individuals. The climate crisis is not a situation we've come to because of individual actions. We're not here at this stage of the climate crisis because individually we don't turn off the tap when we brush our teeth. we have to understand that we're here in the climate crisis as the result of systems. And I want to mention some of these systems and see if I can't explain what they are, because it's really the undoing of these systems that is the cure to the climate crisis. So without taking I know these words have political connotations, but allow me to explain myself. I'm looking at the system of capitalism as a means of the consumption of resources, by which industries consume resources, sometimes in their own countries, sometimes in other countries, for the benefit of consumers throughout the world. I'm talking about patriarchy. Again, not necessarily in the perspective of feminism, but as a system of control over the consumption of resources. You see, if you put the man at the middle of the household unit and the middle of society, you are creating a means by which resources are consumed, and also creating a structural disadvantage towards women, which is what feminism is. It's the fight against patriarchy as a system of discrimination. These systems of consumption of resources are based on consumption as a society. We as a society are a consumer society where many times our identities are forged with the things that we can buy or associate with our names or with our persons. And it's this demand of consumerism that's leading to the, through patriarchy, the type of capitalism and consumption of resources, all driven by the fossil fuel economy, that have thrown up truly anomalous situations internationally. There was a study done recently where there were some 90 companies that were identified as being the major historical polluters globally of greenhouse gases. Just 90 companies have done most of the polluting, greenhouse gas polluting. They've done most of the extraction. 90 companies. And their shareholders on these companies who have known full well the damage that they have caused through the extraction of their resources to the earth. And yet, through systems like capitalism, patriarchy, and consumerism, continue to do business like they do. This here is a chart from NEPRA taken in a study done by the Center for Research in Energy and Environment, which is an Indian think tank. They did this with Davar Bhatt, who's a Pakistani policy analyst. Laurie Milvilta, who used to be with the Greenpeace. They did a study of Thar coal about April this year and found that renewable energy tariffs in Pakistan are actually cheaper than fossil fuel tariffs in Pakistan. In other words, there is no financially sound reason to continue producing electricity using furnace oil or coal in Pakistan anymore. I mean, someone might throw the words basic base load or other things at me, but I'm talking about financial sense. There is no reason why we should continue to invest in coal-fired power plants or coal-fired anything, but for the systems that have brought us to this point. The systems of consuming resources, the systems of capitalism, consumerism, the fossil fuel economy, and the patriarchy. And also, one final point about our consumerist society. And this is oftentimes because we think of the problem of climate change in terms of the nation state, in terms of what countries have done. Oftentimes we hear about America stepping out of the Paris Agreement, or the fact that Pakistan is not an overall large greenhouse gas emitter as compared to China or India or countries in the European Union. This is when you compare greenhouse gas emissions on a country by country basis, which is one way of looking at the problem. But it's not, in my opinion, the best way of looking at the problem, because that's not necessarily how climate change works. This graph over here shows you the consumption of resources by affluence, and shows you that the 10 richest, or the 10% of the richest people on earth consume about 50% of the world's resources. It's not country by country as much as it is across a spectrum of affluence. Sometimes people say that the population explosion is one of the drivers of climate change. And this is a dangerous fallacy, because it assumes that all people's consumption of resources is equal. Per capita, we all consume equally. But this is terribly, terribly incorrect, because the vast number of people on Earth hardly have an equitable share in the resources to be able to consume them. And in fact, a vast number of resources are consumed by the very, very elite few. I mean, just think of the resources required of owning a private yacht or flying in first class, for example. And so it's better to think of climate change on a scale of affluence rather on a scale of country by country basis. So it's undoing these systems, I think, that's crucial in understanding the climate crisis and trying to address it. I'm not saying that as an alternative to capitalism, we have to have socialism. No, I'm not like that. I'm talking about capitalism as a form of consuming resources. And we need to look at the system and undo the way we consume resources and replace it with another, better way of consuming resources that prevents us from reaching the ecological and climate disaster and catastrophe that we're facing today. And in this world, in these dramatically changing times, my advice, or my advice when people ask, well, what can we do? Well, first of all, you have to address these systems. But as these systems have supported so much of what we know to be normal in the world, things like governance institutions, the way we deal with one another, have all been created out of these systems over the course of the last 100, 150 years. We're going to be witnessing the collapse of these systems. And along with the collapse of these systems, we're going to be seeing the collapse of familiar things like governance, for instance. Even today, as resources are being exploited and the climate crisis is reaching a zenith, we find that democratic principles around the world are being flouted. And we're seeing the emergence of these strongmen, these tyrants in India and in Turkey and in South America and in the United States. So in these dramatically changing environmental times, we're also going to face dramatically changing political times. We're going to face the collapse of many structures and many systems that we found support and solace in. And in these changing times, in my opinion, real tools that you need to be able to wield are knowledge, empathy, and relationships. Because as things that you relied upon in the past break down, it's our ability to be able to seek and identify and empathize with the humanity of others that is going to see us through this climate crisis. And that's what I mean by empathy. And you can only really do that by having nurturing relationships, really developing relationships. I know it sounds a bit idealistic, but facing these types of catastrophes or challenges that we're going to see during the course of this century will involve the rewriting of many of the habits we have come to consider absolutely normal. And when that happens, things like knowledge and empathy and having relationships that you can rely upon are really the strengthening bond that will see us through. And with these words, I would like to conclude my lecture on climate change and our future. And I would love to hear if any of you have any questions about this or any other issues related to climate change in Pakistan.
Rafay, thank you so much. When we initially invited you, you had promised that you could scare the pants off of all of us with what you had to say. So I think some questions will keep rolling in, but let me start with a few that we've already gotten. So you phrased this, or you've positioned this as a systemic issue, right? There are largely systemic issues and they're global. But I was reading today, a colleague shared with me that even sending an email has a carbon cost. So what do we do about the system on an individual basis? What responsibility do we also share at a personal level? And what do we do to produce a systems shift?
I read somewhere that carrying out a Google search because there's a server somewhere in Alaska that's hosting all this data. And it's probably run off electricity. The grid is probably using coal or some sort of furnace oil or some sort of fossil fuel. So the amount of energy it takes for a single Google search is about the amount of energy it takes to heat a kettle of water for 1 cup. In fact, watching a movie on a streaming service has an impact in terms of climate. It's like burning a few kilograms of diesel, if you think about it. Now these conversions are being made. I think it's reflective, firstly, on, again, how the climate crisis has corresponded with our society's exploitation of energy. Because none of this would be possible. Even this meeting that we're having today wouldn't be possible unless there was electricity somewhere powering us. But the point is, as I showed, that there are renewable energies that are cheaper than fossil fuel-based energies today. Around the world, solar is probably the cheapest form of electricity now, yet we persist in fossil fuel electricity because there is a system in place. Here in Pakistan, for instance, we've signed on to 30-year long-term independent power producing contracts, mostly with Chinese investors that have locked us into long-term fossil fuel contracts, despite the fact that cheaper alternatives exist today. That's a systemic issue, you see? And it doesn't matter how much you or I are environmentalists, unless we change the energy regime driving this computer and this Zoom call as a system, we're not going to be able to do something about climate change. But then again, people ask me, no, seriously, what can we do as individuals? All right, well, some of the most carbon intensive activities we do, and again, remember that climate change affects people on the scale of affluence. Most people who drive cars will probably find that that's the most polluting thing they'll ever do. Most people who have the ability or the luxury to fly will find that that's perhaps the most greenhouse gas intensive thing that they can do, especially if they're flying business class, which is multiple levels of emissions higher than flying economy class. So maybe in the future, we'll find, just like we saw in the later part of the 20th century, where smoking went out of style. It used to be heavily advertised, but now isn't so. We will see social behaviors and attitudes change towards tourism. And that might have repercussions on people's ability to perform Hajj, for example. We might have serious issues about people, and I'm serious here, these are revolutionary words in Punjab. You might have to stop having tikkas, because the coal is a fossil fuel that produces greenhouse gases and air pollution. So there are some serious changes that people can undertake. And these are big asks, but these are the sort of unprecedented steps we need to take to be able to deal with the climate crisis.
I'll move on to another question. And so can you, I know you talked about it, and you talked about it as bands of affluence, but are there countries that have managed to reduce and maintain low greenhouse gas emissions? Which countries have done well? Which are the main offenders then?
Sadly, there are no real success stories here. The countries that have managed to make tilts and shifts are already small polluters. The Mauritius, for example, has probably some of the most ambitious climate policies, and the Maldives as well have some of the most ambitious climate policies on earth, mostly because it's in their political interest to be able to say we don't want more than 1.5 degrees of warming, because they will be literally wiped off the face of the earth. And their contribution to greenhouse gases is negligible. And even if they're successful in implementing their policies, it might not have a larger international repercussion as long as countries like the United States and China and Brazil and India continue to do what they're doing.
So actually that leads on to another question. Somebody had asked if there was really any society of higher level of affluence that had moved in the right direction. But I gather again, as you said, nothing worth mentioning.
No, I mean, I'll single out California, which has proven time and again to be able to set very ambitious environmental targets and meet them. And despite having very tough environmental regulations, remains one of the largest economies in the world. I believe California is like the 8th largest economy in the world if you look at it in terms of its own GDP. And they've done this while keeping their water clean and their air clean as well. So for instance, Governor Newsom has recently announced that by 2030, they're going to completely phase out fossil fuel cars in California. They already have some fantastic recycling work, and other environmental work, which is spearheaded, ironically, by Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, who started off as an anti-environmentalist, but ended up as a dyed-in-the-wool environmental freak.
There's another question, and it's, what you're talking about as far as the antidote to this. It seems like it goes well beyond a socio-political issue. It seems almost an ethical and moral issue. Yeah. Do you want to comment on that?
it is an ethical and moral issue. I think going forward, we're going to become familiar with the phrase ecocide. We're going to, as systems begin to collapse, politicians will be accused of making decisions knowing full well of their impacts on the ecosystem. So there will be social change going forward. But I wanted to make another point about the inability, it seems almost, of the international community to do anything about this crisis. And it has to go to the formation. We live now in the 21st century in a world where faced with the climate crisis, the administrative means that we've chosen to deal with it is to divide the globe into 200 small little units, most of which are fighting with one another. We have a nation state system that's essentially designed, pitting one against another. And the nation state system isn't that old. It's not more than 200 or 250 years old. It replaced a system of governance of kingdoms and realms that had existed with this new form, where the primary focus of the nation state was to protect itself and its inhabitants and provide them with a good life, in the simplest of terms. And through the course of the 20th century, the nation state itself was then imbued with various other obligations that came out of a recognition of human rights and fundamental rights. The UN Declaration of Human Rights was signed in 1948, and constitutions after that started recognizing fundamental rights as one of the basic duties of the nation state. So all of the constitutions after World War II all recognize and respect fundamental rights explicitly, as it were. However, in this entire design, and it was later on in the 20th century that environmentalism and the climate movement really started politically at an international level, it seems that the climate concerns have not been able to properly integrate themselves into this model of the nation state and its recognition of fundamental rights. Because these things were created, or the nation state was created before the climate crisis rose its head, and so isn't designed to deal with it. The nation state can be beaten into a welfare state or a social state that provides healthcare or provides education or provides transport infrastructure. But there isn't a nation state out there right now that's hardwired to protect the ecology and the environment. It just isn't part of the package design right now. And because it's such a fundamental issue, it's a near philosophical issue, that these now veer into the realm of morality and moral decisions. So the ability of nation states to be able to adapt will be the ability of statesmen to be able to recognize ecocidal decisions from life-saving, earth-saving decisions.
Along these lines, we've seen that the countries that have done better in response to the COVID crisis, countries like New Zealand or Germany, tend to have leaders that are more empathetic. They have a more compassionate style of leadership. And the underlying thing is that they're women. Do we see anything similar as far as the environment and protecting it goes? Are any of the countries that are led by a certain type of leader doing better?
Let me answer that by telling you of a common question or remark that I have to face, which is that, Rafay, the environment is all well and good. I mean, we'll cut a couple of trees down to build a road, but we'll plant the trees again. What we really need in Pakistan is some economic development so that people have a bit of money in their wallet and food in their belly, and then we can turn our attention to things like cleaning up the water and fixing up the trees. As if environmental regulation or environmental protection was a destination on the path of economic development, a certain destination that you come to. But I found, and maybe I should do some research on this some more, maybe even write about this, that almost everywhere in the world where environmental law or a sense of environmentalism has crept up has been in response to the consumption of resources by industry, whether that be in what are now the beautiful confines of Geneva with Swiss acid factories poisoning the rivers, whether it be industrial pollution in the United States, coal pollution through the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom or in Russia. Wherever pollution increased, it was civil society that protested. In India, as a matter of fact, the consumption of resources by the British and subsequently by the Indian government, especially by the Indian government, because it was felt at that time that at least an Indian government shouldn't treat the population the way the colonialists did. It was the consumption of forest resources that generated one of, India's classical environmental movement starts from the Chipko movement, which was in the 1970s. It was the response of people who lived, indigenous communities who lived in forests, who were responding to the acquisition of forests, so that sort of nationalization of forests and the loss of their ability to use forests for their own means. And it was women at the forefront being able to identify that that forest provides my children medicine, or my child is sick because of the water that's being given over here, or even in Sweden, the automobile revolution, because Sweden and a lot of Northern European countries are incredibly cycle friendly. You'll find that there was an incredible amount of resistance by parents, especially mothers, against the number of deaths of children resulting from automobile collisions. Then coming about to a political sort of realization that we want to transition. So everywhere in the world where there's been a sort of recognition of environmental rights, it's been civil society, and interestingly, mostly led by women, that have fought the systems of capitalism, patriarchy, consumerism, and the fossil fuel economy to stake their claim. And what I mean to say there is that the protection of the environment isn't a destination. It is something you fight for all the way, because there is not a single rich country that's dirty.
There's a whole host of questions that are coming in with a special focus on Pakistan and what we're doing. But before we get to that, there's a question about how you mentioned that global warming has happened in the past. So it's sort of two parts to this. One, what kind of evidence is there, if you could just elaborate on that? But also, obviously, in the past, people have used coal and other forms that have been detrimental. So did that also then contribute to pollution?
Well, it's sometimes the history of energy is very interesting, because you're right, coal and carbon like wood has been used for energy sources from time immemorial. But the predominant form of commercial energy or industrial energy wasn't actually coal or wood until they discovered how to harness steam in the 1800s or the 1700s, sorry. The predominant form of major energy was actually water and air. Most mills were run by water or windmills through air, and houses and things like that were heated by wood or heated by coal and so on. The major transition to fossil fuels has taken place since the Industrial Revolution. And it's been a huge shift away from these renewable resources to these fossil fuel-based resources. And that's a fascinating history as well, because the energy conversion of a water wheel is actually much higher than the energy conversion you get from burning coal to produce electricity. So why would anyone produce energy less efficiently than water? Well, that's because using water as an energy source actually restricts the industrialist in the location of his industry, because the industry has to be located where water is available. Something like coal allows an industrialist to locate his industry close to where the labor market is, close to cities. And because coal can be mined somewhere else and there's a fairly regular supply of it that isn't affected by seasonal changes or floods or weather, an industrialist can use coal, can acquire coal regularly and run the industry the whole year round. So you'll find that the intensity of use of fossil fuels has really shot up since the Industrial Revolution, and it corresponds with the expansion of capitalism and the capture of the labor force as well. They're very, very interesting histories of energy here.
There's comments coming in about the fear of what will happen 14 days from now when the US elects its next president, particularly if it remains the same administration. Before, if you choose to comment on that, great. But before that, you talk about there not being a lot of data, or we don't have that baseline data. Does that hamper our ability to then bring about real impact on climate change. So if we don't have baseline or long-term information on local biodiversity, for example, how do we go about mitigating the impact of climate change? Then you don't know where to start or where to
Knowledge,
turn to.
empathy, and good relations. You'll find the answer in those three suggestions. You just have to look at it hard enough. I'm sorry, but I was distracted by a comment here about what type of cars we should be driving in Pakistan. And that's reminded me that this government in December of last year actually approved a very ambitious electric vehicle policy for Pakistan. The stated ambition of which is to make Pakistan a manufacturing hub for, or importing hub for electric vehicles, thereby reducing Pakistan's dependence on imported oil, which will not only be good for greenhouse gas emissions, but also good on our balance of payments and the stability of our dollar. And also by converting to electric vehicles, improving air quality because we won't be burning fossil fuels for transport purposes. So it's a very ambitious policy that was approved last year. It hit some stumbling blocks in as much as the local car manufacturing industry argued that without its consultation, four-wheelers should be kept off the policy implementation level. So right now we have an electric vehicle policy that looks to two-wheelers, three-wheelers, and transport mobiles, buses, and so on and so forth as an opportunity. I think this is fantastic. I also know that MG is starting operations or sales in Pakistan starting next year, and will be introducing an electric vehicle over here as well. So these are opportunities that people who have means to do serious transition to a more sustainable style.
So that's a perfect segue into a lot of the burning questions about Pakistan itself. So there's questions about, let me read this verbatim, in the context of Pakistan when it comes to climate governance, how would you compare pre and post devolution governance? And really, who should be responsible for an efficient climate governance in Pakistan? And to follow up, what are then the key priorities?
Yeah. The background to this question is that the administration of the environment was a concurrently governed system by the Federation and the provinces before the 18th Amendment, but in practice was regulated by the federal government through the Pakistan Environment Protection Agency. And that after the 18th Amendment, each province has its own environmental law, its own environmental agency. And so the implication is that the 18th Amendment has led to a confusion in the implementation of environmental laws and generally a degradation of the environment. I don't know, maybe I'm getting older, but I seem to recall those wonderful days before the 18th Amendment when everything in Pakistan was well governed. I mean, that's not the case. It's not as if the environment was well governed before the 18th Amendment, only to, lose its stilts after the 18th Amendment. It's been a largely neglected area of government regulatory responsibility historically, not just now, historically. The capacity of the environment protection agencies to fulfill the responsibilities that they have been given is laughably short. I mean, people look to the Sindh Environment Protection Agency to do things like keep Karachi clean or the air clean, which is a laughable proposition when you consider that the city only has 19 inspectors with powers of enforcement for a city of 25 million. I mean, really, it's like taking a knife to a gunfight. It's not even a reasonable proposition. So climate governance and environmental governance has been a back burner issue for many, many years. It's not even a portfolio most politicians wish to take up because there's very little money to be made in it as well. But that said, there are more intelligent ways of introducing climate and environmental governance into things. We are in Pakistan facing a first generation of environmental regulation where we penalize the polluter by sealing their industry. It's a very carrot and stick mechanism. Follow the law or we shut you down, which is also a net zero game, and it's not very business friendly. So other countries have realized that instead of shutting businesses down, you invite or you offer financial incentives and tax breaks for various environmental performances and start using environmental law as a regulatory tool rather than a penal tool. That's the second generation of environmental law, which is something we haven't gotten to in Pakistan. And in some countries, like in China or in South Korea, they have mainstreamed environmental control, environmental management into the very economic and financial policies of the country. which is the third generation of environmental law, where you actually start considering the ecosystem as part of your responsibilities, which again is someplace that Pakistani environmental governance can aspire to.
So if you had a magic wand, what would you want Pakistan to do? There are people asking about whether we should be looking at solar energy, whether hydro energy. Where would you wave your magic wand, particularly in the context of Pakistan?
A lot of behavior has to change. I mean, we can talk about energy, but let me speak a little bit about water, because the figures have been so widely discussed in the media in the last few years. We're told that Pakistan is running out of water, but we're also told that the vast amount of water that is in Pakistan is used in the agriculture sector. It's used for the production of rice, cotton, wheat, or sugar. Now, take rice, for example. We export more rice in Pakistan than we consume. The same is true with sugar. So if there's a water shortage, please go ask the Rice Exporters Association of Pakistan, because they seem to be making money off of all of this. So if I had a magic wand, I would wave it so that we could develop a discourse of environmental appreciation and climate governance, where we can see the bad guys far more clearly than we do today. Contrast that with the hundreds of thousands of children in Europe who are taking time off school to protest the lack of climate governance. I mean, they must see something that we don't, that they're taking time off school to do this, right? How come we're not looking at these sorts of issues? Well, it's because that generation, the global north, has the discourse has identified the bad guys. It's the greenhouse gas emitters. It's those 90 companies that have historically made money polluting the earth. And so they have a discourse that drives them to action. Hamare yahan, the discourse is largely high, we're going to be flooded, we're not going to have water scarcity and stuff like that. But we have to understand that within our local context, we have bad guys. Take the sugar industry, for example. There are 92 sugar mills in Pakistan. And there are about 24 ethanol refineries that are associated with these sugar mills. Ethanol is a byproduct. Well, they take the byproduct of sugar, they put it through a distillery and produce ethyl alcohol, which is essentially either transport or food grade alcohol. And they export it because there's no market for it over here. And 2 years ago, ethanol exports in the Islamic Republic of Pakistan were $420 million. So if we're running out of water, I want to ask the ethanol manufacturers in the Islamic Republic why they're making so much money off of it. So we need to develop our discourse to see that there are actual bad guys over here as well who are consuming resources disproportionately without proper ecological consideration. We have to change our morality to be able to see the ecocidal tendencies of these behaviors as well.
So how does one do that again at a systems level then? How do you generate a conversation and that discourse at a systems level? Because the individual level may not work.
It's a magic wand. I'm not supposed to have practical
you don't have the solution.
Practical answers to this. I'd be doing something else and making lots of money.
So there's, again, speaking of systems level, there's a question about whether different countries should have different frameworks of response then, or is it really one large global response that we should be looking at?
The UNFCCC, when it started off, had a way of looking at countries depending on the level of their economic development or the amount of historical greenhouse gases that they had. So if you were a developed country, what was called an Annex 1 country, your responsibility was to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions or to mitigate them. And less developed countries or Annex 2 countries had a responsibility not to mitigate, mostly because they weren't producing that level of greenhouse gas, but they had a responsibility to invest their resources into adapting to the climate changes that are going to happen. So to adapt their agriculture to increased heat stress, adapt their water infrastructure for flooding, adapt their urban planning to take into account heat waves, whatever it is that's necessary for adaptation. And this distinction between countries was recognized through the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. That everyone has the responsibility to fight climate change, but it differs in how they're going to approach it, whether by mitigation or by adaptation. But that was in 1992, when the great hope was to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions and carbon concentrations in the atmosphere were about 340. They're now over 400. Okay, the UNFCCC hasn't worked. So why should we continue to, use these distinctions? We are now facing a climate catastrophe where we have to stop thinking of it purely in terms of how countries have to operate, but also in terms of how the affluent have to operate with respect or compared to the less affluent. It's our habits of consumption, the energy that we're consuming now, that is causing climate change. So we have to not just press on countries to do things, but the affluent societies within those countries to change their behaviors. No one should be driving an SUV. They pollute far more than an automobile, a regular sedan. So this idea of having a social status attached to a greenhouse gas emitter has to go. Those behaviors have to change as well.
And certainly, I, along with others, is certainly guilty of these kinds of behaviors. A lot of stuff that climate change deniers will often say is that global warming is just a cycle, right? You had it some time ago, it'll come up. Is there any truth to this? Is there any data behind this that for some reason it's just more critical this time?
Yeah. You have historical cycles. They're every few thousand years, and you'll find ups and downs. But the thing about this cycle is that it's entirely man-made. The previous cycles of global cooling and warming didn't have industrial activity that was spewing out greenhouse gases. Those changes took place for natural reasons and for different reasons. What we're seeing now, the carbon concentrations that we're seeing now, these aren't caused by a meteor hitting the Earth. These are caused by human behavior and consumptive behavior that have led us to this point. So yeah, there is no two ways about the climate science. This is a very much man-made anthropogenic phenomenon.
And maybe as a last question, what are think tanks and other agencies doing to influence government and policy within Pakistan? You'll probably have seen in the chat feature a lot of questions about the Thar Power Coal project. So what is there to do, magic wand and jokes aside, to generate that kind of discourse at the highest levels?
Well, we have a Pakistan Climate Change Council, of which I'm a member. I've been a member of for 2 years. And the only reason I actually mention that is because it gives me the opportunity to point out that despite the fact that this government, though this political government, unlike other political parties, wears its green credentials on its sleeve, despite the fact that they wear those credentials on their sleeve, they have not convened a meeting of the Climate Council, of which I'm a member, for the last 3 years. So the one institution that's responsible for formulating and implementing climate policy in Pakistan by law has not been convened by this government. So there are institutions, they have to be empowered and given the authority to sort of move forward. And I understand that a lot of our positioning on energy and climate issues, in the previous government were very much hemmed in by our approach to China and CPEC, where we couldn't actually make the reductions in greenhouse gases that people like myself would have wanted, because CPEC transactions envisaged the investments in coal-fired power plants, over 24 of them, as a matter of fact. So the state of Pakistan couldn't take a position that it was going to reduce greenhouse gases when it was actually importing these coal-fired plants from China. So our environmental policy in the last 5-6 years has been heavily influenced by the investments we've made in this region.
Rafi, it's already after 5 o'clock, and really the questions will keep rolling in, but we'll probably have to pause here. I just want to thank you, and this is probably the first and the last time I'll ever thank one of our speakers for actually scaring the pants off of us. But maybe, especially given the intersection of environment and health, and I mentioned the IGHD here at AKU, we'll have the pleasure of seeing you sometime in the future in Karachi and continuing these conversations and really having that kind of discourse. The reason we do these talks, as I mentioned in the intro, maybe the folks that are on here, they're part of your magic wand and they can take this conversation forward at all levels. But I want to thank you. It was certainly enlightening, if scary. And we look forward to future discussions that may emanate from here. Thank you so much, Rafi, on behalf of all of us.
Allah Hafiz.
Allah Hafiz.